Hey guys, thanks so much for dropping by to the David Pidula podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the best ways that every band member can prepare for the studio in 2022. As I was editing this episode, I realized I am talking very fast, so you are going to want to take notes for sure. Or if you don't like taking notes and you just want to get the corresponding PDF guide with this episode, subscribe to the David Pidula podcast at davidpidulapodcast.com, and I will send you that PDF guide later this month with the newsletter. I figured this was a great place to start for the new year, and it would give everyone a great idea of what the best things they can do for their band are, as well as give myself a good refresher. So you might hear my voice is a little rough right now. I lost my voice the last week because we had a moldy Christmas tree. It was pretty bad. So we got that out of the house, and I'm feeling a lot better now, but still just some residual gunk. So before we begin, if you want to support the show, share all these episodes with your friends. That is the absolute best way to do it. And of course, you can always check out the merch store. There's always new stuff being added to it. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. Being prepared for the studio is more than just being able to play your parts. Studio prep, in my mind, has 5 main stages. Number 1 is your mindset. Number 2 is your musical preparedness. Number 3 is your instrument preparedness. Number 4 is actually being in the studio while tracking. And then number 5 is the pre-release. I know this is prepping for the studio, and then some of it is actually in the studio, and some of it is even after the studio. So make sure you pay attention to all this stuff. All of it is really important for any band trying to do this for real. I've actually got a free guide on this for any subscribers to the David Pidula podcast. So if you want to go to davidpidulapodcast.com, I'll have a link in the description box below. If you subscribe to the podcast, I send out newsletters once in a while, and this will be on the next one later this January. It'll be a free PDF. You don't have to pay for anything. I'm not going to sell your information. It's literally just a free PDF guide that I want you to show to your band so you guys can prepare for the studio, whether you work with me or somebody else. This is going to be useful for everybody. All right, so let's get into it. Stage 1, like I said, is mindset. That comes first because this will ultimately define your experience in and out of the studio. It defines who you are as a band and how the rest of the world will see you. I can't stress this enough. The first step of mindset happens before you even decide to book. It starts at practice and in the writing phase. So step 1 for mindset is discussing your goals as a band and the goals for the release. Discussing your goals as a collective will create a clear path that you should follow. Goals can be reaching a certain number of Facebook likes or Spotify plays, a certain amount of music videos, or even approaching a record label. After you understand the intentions for this release, you need another perspective. And there's no one better than the producer because they're going to be helping you reach that goal. At least they should be. Having a producer and not just an engineer is so important for so many reasons. And I know what it's like to be in the band and think, oh, we're self-produced and everyone's going to love it. No one cares. No one cares if you're self-produced. Think about the bands that you listen to. Do you think to yourself, oh man, this sounds so good, I just wish they did it all themselves? Typically not. Typically, if it sounds really good, you want to find out who mixed it and who did a good job on it. The thing that the really successful bands and artists have that a lot of the unsuccessful bands don't is a team of people working with them to create the best product possible. And this is one thing that a band around here called Disco Naps does really well. They just had an album release show, and we recorded the entire thing so they can have a live album as well. But then they got a team of people to do lights and live sound and projection, and the venue support was amazing. And they had a really good team of people working on everything else so that they just had to focus on making great music, and it turned out awesome. The best thing you can do for your band is have a good team of people. It's not going to happen overnight. You've got to build up to that, and it will come over time. Going back to the whole producer thing and discussing your goals with them, the best producers will have your best interest in mind. Do not work with a producer who is focused on themselves, because if they don't have your best interest in mind, then your album is not going to turn out the way you want it to turn out. And that's not to say every producer that is focused on giving you a good product is the right producer. Like I've been approached by some people that I just know are not going to be a good fit, and I care about giving them a good product, so I send them to somebody else who can do the job better. And that's why you've got to talk with a producer about your goals for the release and what kind of sound you're going for, and just the whole mindset behind the album, because if they're not the right one, if they're a good producer and they know they're not the right fit, they'll send you to someone who is. It's not just something I do to toot my own horn. It's something that people do in this field a lot to make better products for the band, and then they get to help their friends out. So it's pretty common. Just make sure, I can't stress this enough, make sure you are talking to your producer about the goals of the release and the overall sound that you're going for. Now, step 3 is understanding the intentions of the release or the plan for success. After meeting with your band and a worthy producer, both parties should have a common understanding of what the intentions are for the release. At this point, certain things can start to be put in place to make the release successful. For example, you can reach out to a certain video producer to get ideas for a music video ready. You can reach out to a mastering engineer. Like if you're a metal band, there's certain mastering engineers who are really good at mastering metal. There are certain mastering engineers who are really good at mastering indie stuff. So you can start to put certain things in place that will make the whole release a lot better. And you can have this stuff planned out well in advance. So you can plan for the budget, you can plan for the time frame, and you can get this all done in a timely manner without any surprises coming up. All right, that was it for stage 1. That was the long part, so stick with me here. Stage 2 is musical preparedness. Musical preparedness is a stage that sounds pretty obvious, but there are so many musicians that book studio time and still don't know the structure of the song. That becomes a waste of valuable studio time for everyone, so follow these simple steps to prepare. Step 1, don't just practice to a click, challenge yourself. Practicing to a click is one thing, but if you challenge yourself to be precise with every click, like every downbeat, you are hitting the drum at the same time as the click. You are strumming that chord nice and strong and in time with the click. You'll become a more confident player and crush it in the studio. There's this little thing in the studio called red light syndrome. It's when you press record, the red light is going, and the player just freezes up. It happens to us guitar players a lot. If you're practicing to a click every day, and you're actually recording yourself too, and it's never been cheaper or easier, you can do it on your phone if you want. If you are used to recording by the time you're in the studio, all the nerves are going to be gone. Well, not all of them maybe, but most of the nerves are going to be gone, and you're just going to crush it. So really pay attention to the details in practice, because that makes a big difference everywhere else. All right, step 2, know your parts. Every single note. I don't have to describe this one much, just know your own music, and if you're not sure about something, talk to your other bandmates before you come into the studio, because it's good to practice it before you try to record it. And step 3, practice daily before hitting the studio. And yes, daily, don't make excuses, make results. If you want to create music for a living, you have to be dedicated to becoming the best musician you can possibly be. The pros practice daily, and you should too if you want to be at their level. I'm not saying you've got to be the most technical player ever, but you've got to be solid, and you've got to be confident. And the only way you're going to get that solid confidence is if you practice daily. All right, stage 3, the instrument preparedness. Now, having your instrument ready is just as important as having your music ready. No one cares how cool that guitar riff is if every note is out of tune. I'm going to go through each band member here and talk about what you can do to prepare your instrument for the studio. So vocalists, you are your own instrument. So the best thing you can do is great vocal warm-ups every day. And you can find some on YouTube. I'll have a link below. My favorite ones are some I found in like 2013 by Eric Arsenault. I think that's how you say his name. So he's got 4 videos from 2013 called Professional Vocal Warm-Up. It's numbers 1 through 4. And they have millions of views each. I truly believe this is the best free training a vocalist can get, and it will give you better results instantly. If you are at least a good singer even, these professional vocal warm-ups are going to take you the extra 25% to make you into a great singer. Now, just make sure you do them every day, though. For guitar and bass, there's a few things here. Use thicker strings and have a professional setup. Now, I can sense apprehension already because as a guitar player myself, I always liked using thinner strings because it was a little bit brighter and it was way easier to play. But the thicker strings are going to keep your guitar so much better in tune, especially if you're using a heavy pick and slamming into those chords, getting like a really chunky sound. You need thick strings. And it's going to give you a fatter tone, it's going to give you a more in-tune tone, and they're going to last a little bit longer so you can have like a whole day or two of tracking with those strings. The next thing you should do is have a professional setup. Whether you can do it yourself or you know somebody who can do it, a professional setup is absolutely necessary before you record guitars and bass. Like I said before, no one cares how cool that guitar solo is if every other note is out of tune. So make sure those two things are done and you're practicing every day and you will crush it. So on to drummers. I know being a drummer is probably the most expensive musical endeavor out there. So I understand that it's hard to put more money into it because everything you own is so expensive already. But you've got to have fresh heads and clean your bearing edge when you change your heads. The worst thing drummers do when they change their heads is they just take the old ones off and put the new ones on right away. What that does is it leaves all the dirt in the bearing edge and it makes the head sit unevenly on top of the bearing edge, on top of the drum. Basically, it's not going to tune properly because it's not even anywhere on that point of the bearing edge. When you change your heads, first talk to your producer about what kind of sound you're going for and what's going to work best with their mics. And your producer should know this. So if you're a producer and listening to this, know your drum heads, know your mics, because you've got to be the best you can possibly be for the band you're working with. But drummers, talk to your producer, figure out which heads you should get, and expect to buy new batter and reso heads for each drum. The way I tune my drums, a lot of the pitch comes from the bottom head, and a lot of the tone comes from the top head. And if they're not in good balance, if one is super old and gross, the drum just doesn't sound right. Also have lots of extra sticks. This recording is something people will hear for a long time, probably forever until the sun explodes, and it should sound as good as it possibly can. Don't skimp out on something that you're going to regret later, you know? And clean your bearing edges. And some studios like mine will provide some of the drum heads as well. Like if the project is big enough, I will front the money for at least the top heads because I know what I like in a recording. I know what's going to sound good, and then the drummer can buy all the reso heads because they know what they like for that. And one more thing about drums, if you're using the studio's kit, make sure they have fresh heads for you. I've been to a few studios where they just leave old heads on, and that's fine if it's like a single at a time. But if you're doing a whole album and you want this to sound as good and as punchy as possible, make sure that the house kit has fresh heads for you, or use your own kit with fresh heads. All right, so we got brass and woodwind players next, and last actually. This one's pretty easy. Just clean your instrument and have new reeds and a mouthpiece. Having your instrument cleaned can make a big difference in tone and tuning, and it will overall extend the life of your instrument. It's good to do this every so often, but especially before hitting the studio. Woodwind players need to have a new reed and extra reeds on hand to keep consistent concert-ready tone. Brass players, I highly recommend having a new mouthpiece for the studio. I've played lots of brass instruments over the last 15 years, and I know how chipped and beaten up these can get. A brand new one is going to make you more comfortable while you're playing, and it's going to spread your embouchure evenly and give you more consistent tone. All right, that is it for stage 3. Now we're into stage 4, the tracking. Tracking is the actual recording process. This is typically the most fun part, but it can be the most difficult part for many musicians. These next few tips will make it very easy for you and your band to get through the tracking like a breeze. So step 1 is be open to new ideas. Many of the bands I work with have 1 or 2 primary writers, and in the studio, sometimes the other band members want to try adding something. They're more comfortable doing it in the studio with a producer's opinion. Things they want to add are typically like a synth pad or a reverse cymbal. And it can be really easy to shoot those ideas down when you've never heard it before, but just about everything is worth trying if there's a chance it will take your song to the next level, given that there's time. If there's not enough time, then you kind of got to be a little more conservative about what ideas you're throwing out there. But generally speaking, it's good to hear from other members of the band, to hear the different creative aspects that can be added to the song. All right, step 2, trust your producer and engineer. You're paying them for a reason. Most likely, you hired a producer and engineer because you like the sound of their work and you trust them. Every engineer has a process, and changing it too much can get them out of their flow state and they're not going to work as consistently. That said, if you see or hear something you don't like, make sure that your producer is comfortable with criticism, because if you hate your guitar tone and you don't speak up, you're going to regret that in 10 years. Hell, you're going to regret it in 10 days. So if there's something you don't like, don't be afraid to say something. Just don't try to throw too many ideas out there that are going to throw the whole tracking process off of a flow state. Step 3 is stay positive. The studio is a really fun place to be. I've had clients tell me on more than one occasion that they just want to keep recording and they don't want to finish the record because they're having so much fun. But sometimes it can be a difficult process for some people. Not getting the takes right can lead to a lack of confidence and arguments between the band members. That gets kind of awkward. So it's really easy to be hard on yourself and your bandmates, but you've got to stay positive to keep the whole thing going and support each other. Now, most bands I work with are just amazing about this. They're such good friends. It's like they're friends first and they're musicians second. And that goes a long way in the studio when you're trying to support each other. I always say bands that make a great team go places. All right, and stage 5 is your pre-release. So this is your big moment. You and your band finally get to show the world what you've been working on. You can do this really right or really wrong. So here are some ways to help you do it really right. Step 1, don't have a release date until everything is finished. I had to put this one first because nothing can go worse than advertising a release date for months only to disappoint your fans. I've made this mistake in one of my bands before, and I cannot stress enough to only set a release date once you have the final product in hand. Step 2, take pictures and video for social media. This should be happening the whole process, but you can start advertising this kind of stuff for your pre-release. So a lot of your fans will come from social media, and the best way to give them what they want is to take pictures while you're in the studio, while you're writing. Just make sure it's a nice-looking space. If you're recording at a friend's house, don't post a picture of a guitar player sitting in front of a rat's nest of cables. Instead, take a photo of the guitar player on the couch while recording the solo. Just make sure it looks good. And step 3 is commission album art and have it ready before the album is done. I say this for a few reasons. One of them is to streamline the process and have everything ready to release. Another is because some engineers, myself included, like to use the album art during the mastering process to create a DDP with metadata. Super nerdy stuff. Let me simplify that. You know how, I got to take this way back to like 2005. You know how in iPods, when you bring up the album that you're listening to, and the album art would show up with the song name and the artist? Well, that's all done in the mastering stage. Whether you're using a mastering engineer or the guy who produced it is mastering it, get them the album artwork and the song titles and everything before they actually finish up the album, so that way all this metadata can be baked into the songs. That's it for my studio prep guide in 2022. Don't forget, I will be sending this out as a PDF in my newsletter later this month, and if you're listening to this way in the future, send me a message and I'll get you that PDF if you are still interested in it. If you or your band is looking for a producer or mix engineer for your next musical project, check out sourcetrackstudio.com. I'll have a link in the show notes below. Check out my work, and if you like what you hear, send me a message and hopefully we can work together. And if you're looking for someone else, still take all of these tips and bring them to any studio experience you attend, because so many bands could go a lot farther if they would do these few simple things to make their album the best it could possibly be. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll catch you next week, Tuesday at 6 a.m. for another new episode.